All right, we're going to be talking here for the next few days about the Cold War at home, which plays out with politics in the context of domestic politics, but also, and perhaps more importantly, in the realm of culture. Okay, and you have the emergence between 45 and 55 of a conservative consensus that is the vast majority of Americans embrace two things, we'll say: traditional family values and capitalism, okay? And on the other hand, you have the retreat of the radical left or Marxists from political activity in the 1950s, but they focus instead on kind of trying to bring about social change through the culture, okay? And ultimately, that's going to be much more effective for them than anything they had tried to do in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s in the United States, okay? But this kind of subversive movement through culture is going to bring the radical left a lot more influence than it had ever had in the earlier period, all right? But let's start here with the emergence of this conservative consensus, okay? What is the conservative consensus? What is conservatism? Modern conservatism. Okay, well, the 1945 to 55, what emerges, as I said, is a strong adherence to two things: traditional family values and capitalism. Okay, now traditional family values. All right, what I mean by this in particular is traditional sexual morality. Right, the idea that sex belongs within the context of marriage, and that there is an association between sex and children. Right, sex brings children into existence. And marriage, one of the purposes of it is to provide stable place in which children can be brought up, okay? So sex and marriage going together and sex and children going together. That's kind of what I'm talking about when I say traditional family values, okay? And this is very widely embraced by the generation returning from World War II, okay? And certainly, even if they don't, behave perfectly in this regard, right? Ostensibly, outwardly, they are promoting this idea that sex belongs in marriage and is tied to children, and they believe that, right? They authentically believe those things, okay? Even if they're not perfect human beings, right? Now, look, the veterans coming back, right? They want to have babies. There are a lot of babies. There's a baby boom, right? There's the babies coming. And there also is the opportunity for them to provide for, support, and provide housing for these children, right? First of all, you have a booming economy as the war production turns to consumer item production, okay? And that, booms, explodes the economy. But also, you have a lot of investor optimism. You have certain government programs that are helping veterans get low interest loans so they can start businesses and buy homes, okay? So the veterans are able to provide stability for their families as they are returning from the war, okay? That ties us into the second element, capitalism, okay? Now, capitalism, if it is all about pursuing my own individual power and success and wealth, is not necessarily consistent with family life, right? Because family life is about self-sacrifice, okay? But if I'm pursuing personal prosperity in order to share it with my wife and children, that's beautiful, right? Okay? So in that sense, it fits with this adherence to family values if it's put in the context of we're pursuing profit for the sake of others, for the sake of the wife and children, right? That is, something that is facilitated, of course, by this huge economic boom, right? And all the opportunities that are provided by the consumer revolution, okay? Now, what is also emerging in the context of this consumer revolution is a mass consumer culture, okay? And I just want to talk about that for a second because it's very much associated with the conservative consensus in sort of the way in which we imagine the 1950s, right? We think of the 1950s or the early 60s and we think of that advertising agency that is promoting cigarette use and making it look really amazing to smoke cigarettes and drive Buicks. And basically, the argument is that this consumer culture, this mass consumer culture, which is all about buying things that you don't necessarily need, right? misleads Americans into associating their personal worth with what they can buy, or their happiness with what they can buy. In other words, like, if I can't buy new golf clubs this year, I'm a failure. All right, like, if my house is not as big as, like, my brother-in-law's house, I'm a failure. Or I couldn't buy a new car this year, so I'm a failure, right? So in other words, like, this idea is often lodged against the conservative consensus of the 1950s as a criticism, right? That there's this obsession with consumerism, okay? And that is a legitimate criticism, I'm going to say, right? Like, material items do not provide meaning to your life, right? At all, okay? But insofar as the conservative consensus movement is about the defense of traditional family values, it is also something that is consistent with living a selfless and a good life, okay? A good life in the kind of moral sense of it, right? Now let's deal with the left a little bit. Here we go. All right, the left. Here they are. All right, when I talk about the radical left, I'm talking about Marxists. I'm talking about Marxists, right? And there never have been that many Marxists in the United States in the teens, the 20s, and the 30s, and the 40s, okay? Never that many, right? But in the 1940s, it really becomes impossible for them to be out in the open pursuing political revolution, okay? They have to kind of go underground, all right? Now, what do they support? Well, they support really the exact opposite of what the conservative consensus supports, right? They reject traditional family values. They say that those things are oppressive to women. They also reject capitalism completely, right? They say that personal prosperity is wicked. You shouldn't pursue that. It doesn't bring meaning to you. It's selfish. Don't pursue that, right? So they reject capitalism and traditional family life. And so they have to kind of go underground because the conservative consensus is so strong after the war, okay? And so rather than pursuing political revolution, which was the traditional way in which a Marxist, like, went about his business, right? And it's what Marx kind of orders people to do in the Communist Manifesto. Go out and pursue political revolution. No, they stopped doing that, right? Rather than that, they're going to try to infiltrate culture, okay? So within the universities in particular, they're trying to push certain new ideas, like especially with regards to sexual morality, right? Questioning traditional sexual morality from the point of view of psychology, or questioning the consumer culture from the point of view of philosophy, like this is something that is not meaningful, right? They're kind of trying to poke holes in the conservative consensus mentality is what they do, okay? And Hollywood is involved in this as well, right? And so there emerges by the mid-50s a kind of a small but a influential countercultural movement, okay? And really, this is very clever of the left. They're being patient. They're playing a long game, right? They know that it's not effective right now to push for political revolution. But if you can change the culture, then in the long run, you're also going to have a political revolution, okay? And in the 1950s, they really do sow the seeds for the mass youth movement of the 1960s, which is radicalized by the late 60s, right? Which is united in opposition to traditional sexual morality, which is very critical of capitalism and the consumer economy in particular, okay? And so this counterculture in the 1950s, they have to kind of delay their project, right? But in the long run, they're much more effective. And the anti-communist movement is really in the 50s, it's very dominant, it's very prominent, okay? But it's short-sighted. They're too fixated on short-term political goals, right? And they're not involved enough in the culture and in influencing the culture. And so they're kind of sowing the seeds for their own decay because they're not laying the foundation for a continuation of their movement in the next generation, the baby boom generation, okay?